The morning Margaret Foster swung that axe into frozen timber, she knew two things with absolute certainty. Winter in Montana territory would kill her if she stopped moving, and no help was coming. Ice crystals hung suspended in the bitter January air of 1879, and each breath she drew burned her lungs like fire. The cabin her late husband had built stood behind her, little more than rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, already losing heat faster than her meager fire could generate it. 3 cords of wood remained from what Samuel had cut before the fever took him in November, and she had been rationing it like gold dust, but the brutal cold snap that descended on the land west of Galesburg showed no mercy. Her hands, wrapped in threadbare gloves with the fingertips worn through, gripped the axe handle as she positioned another log on the chopping block. Margaret was 23 years old, and the mountain homestead that had seemed like a promise of new beginnings 18 months ago now felt like a trap slowly closing. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles through snow that reached past her knees in the drifts. Her dark hair, twisted into a practical braid, had come loose around her face, and sweat dampened her collar despite the cold that made the trees crack like rifle shots in the night. She brought the axe down, and the log split with a satisfying crack. Her shoulders ached, her back screamed in protest, and her hands had developed blisters that bled and reformed as calluses. But she kept swinging. Stop moving, stop chopping, and the cold would creep in. The fire would die. She would die. Margaret had just raised the axe for another swing when she heard it, the distinctive sound of hooves breaking through crusted snow. Her heart seized. Out here, visitors meant one of 3 things: someone lost and desperate, someone running from the law, or someone with ill intentions toward a woman alone. She turned slowly, axe still gripped in both hands, and watched as a rider emerged from the tree line. The man sat astride a sturdy roan horse, both of them dusted with snow. He wore a heavy coat the color of aged leather, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. As he drew closer, she could make out more details: broad shoulders, a dark beard, and eyes that seemed to assess the situation in a single sweeping glance. He raised one hand, palm out, in a gesture of peace. "Madam," he called out, his voice carrying across the frozen clearing. "Name's Matthew Sullivan. I'm not here to cause trouble, just riding through and saw your smoke." Margaret didn't lower the axe. "I'm managing fine on my own." He brought his horse to a stop a respectful distance away, near enough to talk without shouting but far enough that she could run if needed. "I can see that," he said, and there was something in his tone that wasn't mockery, just a simple acknowledgement. "Been watching you work from the ridge for the past 10 minutes. You've got good form with that axe." "Then you can watch me work from the trail," she replied, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 27 or 28, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. There was something in his expression that made her pause, though. Not threat, but concern. Matthew dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "How long have you been out here chopping? That's not your concern." "Your hands are bleeding through your gloves," he observed quietly. "And you're favoring your left side. Pulled muscle, probably." "You're alone up here, aren't you?" The accuracy of his observations sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "My husband is inside," she lied. "He's just feeling poorly today." Matthew's eyes moved to the cabin, taking in details she couldn't see. "No smoke from the chimney until about an hour ago. Single set of tracks from the cabin to the woodpile, all the same size. Fresh grave over by those pines, dirt still darker than the surrounding ground despite the snow." His gaze returned to her, and it was gentle. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." But lying about it doesn't change that you're working yourself into the ground and this cold is only getting worse. Margaret's grip on the axe handle tightened, but she found her vision blurring with unexpected tears. She blinked them back furiously. She had cried herself empty in December, and there was no room for tears now, only survival. "What do you want? To help?" He took a step closer and she raised the axe slightly. He stopped. "Just to help. No payment, no expectations. I'll chop enough wood to get you through the next few weeks and then I'll ride on." "Why?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. "Nobody does something for nothing. What do you want from me?" Something flickered in his expression, something old and painful. "My sister died 2 winters ago, up in the mountains near Helena. She was alone after her husband went to town and never came back. Drank himself to death in some saloon, turns out, but Clara didn't know that. She just knew she was alone and she tried to manage. Tried to chop wood and keep warm and wait for help." He paused, his jaw working. "When they found her in the spring, she was froze solid in her bed, and there was a pile of wood she'd been trying to split, still waiting by her door. She'd hurt herself, they figured, maybe broken her wrist and couldn't finish the job, couldn't keep the fire going." Margaret felt something crack in her chest, a wall she had built to keep herself functional. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So when I see a woman alone trying to chop wood in weather that's dropping past 0 at night, I don't just ride by." Matthew's voice was rough but firm. "Let me help, please." The word please undid her. Men in her experience didn't say please. Her father hadn't said it, barking orders at his children like they were hired hands. Samuel had been kinder, but illness had made him irritable those last weeks, demanding water and comfort she struggled to provide. But this stranger, this cowboy who owed her nothing, was asking permission to help. "I can't pay you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't ask for payment. I don't have extra food to spare. I've got my own supplies. I can't." She swallowed hard. "I can't offer anything in return." Matthew's expression hardened, but not with anger. With something fiercer. "Madam, I'm not that kind of man. I'm offering to chop wood, that's all. You can stay inside the cabin if you'd feel safer. Bar the door if you want. Just let me do this." Margaret looked at him, really looked, and saw nothing but sincerity in his wind-burned face. She was so tired, so bone-deep exhausted that the thought of swinging the axe even one more time made her want to weep. "The woodpile is getting low," she heard herself say. "There are trees down past that ridge that need cutting, but I haven't had the strength to drag them back. I'll handle it." He turned to his horse, then paused. "What's your name, madam?" "Margaret Foster." "Mrs. Foster, when's the last time you ate something hot?" She tried to remember. "Yesterday. Some porridge," he nodded, unsurprised. "There's a kettle in my pack. Got some dried beef and beans, coffee too. You get yourself inside and get that fire built up proper. I'll bring the kettle in before I start on the wood. Get some food cooking for both of us. You need to eat something more than watered-down porridge." The offer of food, of coffee, nearly broke her composure entirely. "Why are you being so kind?" "Because somebody should have been kind to Clara." The pain in his voice was raw and real. "And because it's the right thing to do. Now get inside before you catch your death. Those hands need tending." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to maintain some shred of pride and independence, but practicality won out. She was freezing, exhausted, and in pain. If this man meant her harm, he could have enacted it already. Instead, he was offering help she desperately needed. "Okay," she agreed softly. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "Matthew, please. Mr. Sullivan was my father." He actually smiled, just a small quirk of his mouth, but it transformed his stern face into something warmer. "Let me get my horse settled, and I'll bring that kettle up." Margaret watched as he led his horse to the small lean-to Samuel had built for their own mare, the one she'd had to sell to the traveling trader in December for supplies. Matthew moved with the efficient grace of someone comfortable with animals and outdoor work. He unsaddled the roan, rubbed the animal down with handfuls of dry grass, and made sure it had access to the hay she'd been hoarding. She turned and trudged back to the cabin, her legs heavy with exhaustion she'd been ignoring for hours. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals again. She fed it carefully, adding kindling until flames licked up to embrace the larger pieces. The cabin was a single room with a sleeping area curtained off by a blanket Samuel had hung for privacy. A table, 2 chairs, a trunk with their belongings, and the fireplace that served for both heat and cooking. Sparse, but it had been theirs. Now it was just hers, and the emptiness echoed. A knock at the door made her jump. Mrs. Foster, got the kettle and fixings. She opened the door to find Matthew holding a battered coffee pot and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "There's a hook over the fire for the pot," she told him, stepping aside. He entered, and suddenly the cabin felt much smaller. Matthew was a big man, and his presence filled the space in a way that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. He moved to the fireplace, hung the pot with practiced ease, and began preparing coffee with economical movements that spoke of long practice. "There's water in the bucket," Margaret offered. "I'll fill it from the stream after I get this going," he replied. "You got any lard or grease?" "A little. In the tin by the hearth." He found it, added some to a pan, and soon the smell of frying salt pork filled the cabin. Her stomach growled audibly and heat rushed to her face, but Matthew didn't comment. He simply cooked, adding beans from his pack, some wild onion he must have foraged, and a precious pinch of salt. "Sit down," he said without turning around. "Let me see those hands." "I'm fine." "You're bleeding. Sit." There was no heat in his command, just firm expectation. Margaret found herself sinking into one of the chairs, suddenly aware of how much she was swaying on her feet. Matthew left the food to simmer and approached her carefully, like she was a spooked horse. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her gloves. She nodded, too tired to protest. He peeled the worn gloves away gently, revealing hands that were a mess of blisters, some fresh, some broken and weeping. He inhaled sharply through his teeth. "You've been working yourself near to death," he said quietly. "Do you have any clean cloth, whiskey or alcohol?" Samuel had some whiskey, "it's in the trunk. And there's clean linen in there too." Matthew retrieved both, pouring a small amount of whiskey into a tin cup and tearing the linen into strips. "This is going to sting," he warned. "I know." She braced herself. He was gentle but thorough, cleaning each wound and wrapping her hands with a skill that spoke of experience. "You done this before," she observed. "Worked on a cattle drive for 5 years. You learn basic doctoring when you're 3 days from the nearest town and someone gets hurt." He tied off the last bandage. "These need to stay clean and dry, no more chopping for at least a few days." "But the wood, I said I'd handle it." His blue eyes met hers, steady and sure. "And I will." "You need to rest." The coffee began to boil, rich and dark and smelling like heaven. Matthew poured her a cup, adding a precious spoonful of sugar from his supplies before she could protest. "Drink. Food will be ready in a few minutes." Margaret wrapped her bandaged hands around the warm cup and sipped. The coffee was strong and hot, and it spread warmth through her chest like a benediction. She hadn't realized how cold she'd become until now, sitting still, letting someone else take charge. "Why are you riding through in January?" she asked. "Most cowboys winter in town." Matthew stirred the beans, his expression distant. "I worked a ranch down near Virginia City until last month. Boss sold out to a bigger outfit and they brought in their own crew." Heard there might be work up at one of the spreads near Great Falls, so I'm heading that direction. That's still weeks of riding from here. I know, but work's scarce in winter, and I'd rather keep moving than sit idle spending money I don't have. He dished food onto 2 tin plates, handing her one with a fork. Eat, all of it. The food was simple but delicious, and Margaret hadn't realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite. She forced herself to eat slowly, though every instinct screamed at her to devour it. Matthew ate standing up, his attention divided between his meal and watching the windows, alert even in this moment of rest. "You expecting trouble?" she asked. "Always expect trouble. That way you're ready when it comes." He finished his food and set the plate aside. "I'm going to start on that wood now. I'll work until dark, then bed down in the lean-to with my horse if that's acceptable. You can't sleep out there. It's too cold." "I'll manage. Mr. Sullivan, Matthew, I have a bedroll you can use by the fire. I won't have you freezing to death in my lean-to after you've helped me." He studied her for a long moment. "You're sure? I can bar the curtain to the sleeping area. You keep the fire going through the night and we'll both be warmer for it." It was practical, logical, and still her heart hammered at the impropriety of it. A strange man sleeping in her cabin. But then, she'd already crossed so many lines of propriety by surviving alone out here. What was one more? "All right," Matthew agreed. "Thank you." He headed outside, and through the window, Margaret watched him retrieve the axe from where she'd left it by the chopping block. His first swing was powerful and precise, splitting the log cleanly. His second was the same. He worked with a steady rhythm that spoke of strength held in reserve, not the frantic pace she'd been forcing herself to maintain. She cleaned up from the meal, her bandaged hands clumsy but manageable, and then found herself simply watching him work. There was something mesmerizing about the rise and fall of the axe, the flex of his shoulders beneath his coat, the absolute competence in every movement. He wasn't just strong, he was skilled. As afternoon deepened toward evening, Matthew made several trips into the woods, returning each time dragging a fallen tree behind his horse. He'd buck them into manageable lengths, split them, and stack them in neat rows under the eave of the cabin where they'd stay dry. The woodpile grew steadily, and with it, a weight lifted from Margaret's chest that she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. She heated water and made cornbread with the last of her cornmeal, a small offering of thanks. When Matthew finally came inside as darkness fell, he was dusted with wood chips and snow, his face ruddy from cold and exertion. "There's enough wood to last you a month now, maybe more if you're careful with it," he reported. "I'll cut more tomorrow before the next storm comes in." Next storm. Sky's got that look. We'll see snow by tomorrow night, heavy from the feel of it. He shrugged out of his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. Best to get ahead of it. They ate the cornbread with butter she'd churned last week, and Matthew made more coffee. The cabin was warmer than it had been in weeks, the fire fed properly, and for the first time since Samuel died, Margaret didn't feel the constant gnawing anxiety about survival. "Tell me about your ranch work," she said as they sat by the fire after dinner. She was curious about this man who had appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't even voiced. Matthew leaned back, his long legs stretched toward the hearth. "Started when I was 16. My pa died when I was young, and my ma remarried a man who didn't want another man's children around. My older brother headed east to try factory work. My sister Clara married and went to Helena. I went west and found work on a cattle drive. Learned everything from the ground up. How to rope, how to ride herd, how to survive on 4 hours of sleep and coffee so strong it could strip paint." "You liked it, loved it," he admitted. "There's something about being out under the sky, just you and the cattle and your horse. You know where you stand. A cow doesn't lie to you, doesn't pretend to be something it's not. You do right by them, they do right by you." He paused. "Until I heard about Clara anyway. That changed things." "How so?" Made me realize that while I was out playing cowboy, people I cared about were suffering. I should have gone to see her after her husband disappeared, should have checked on her. But I was too caught up in my own life, and by the time I heard, it was too late. His hands clenched into fists on his knees. "So now when I see someone who needs help, I help. It won't bring Clara back, but maybe it'll balance the scales somehow." Margaret's throat tightened. "You can't blame yourself for not knowing. Can I?" His smile was bitter. "I knew her husband was a drunk. I knew she was isolated up in those mountains. I just didn't think it was my problem to solve. And now you think every woman alone is your problem. Now I think that if you can help and you don't, you're complicit in the suffering." He met her eyes. "Maybe that makes me a fool, but it lets me sleep at night." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Margaret found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way shadows played across his features. He was handsome, she supposed, but more than that, he was solid, reliable. In just a few hours, he'd given her something she'd been missing for months: hope. "My husband Samuel, he was a good man," she found herself saying. "He brought me out here because he wanted to make something of himself. He'd been a clerk in Chicago, copying ledgers and contracts, and he hated it. Wanted land of his own, a fresh start. We both did. You came from Chicago." "Born and raised. My father worked in the stockyards. It was dirty, loud, crowded. When Samuel proposed and talked about Montana territory, about mountains and clean air and opportunity, it sounded like a dream." She laughed without humor. "I didn't know anything about living out here. I could barely cook, couldn't chop wood, had never seen a winter like this. Samuel did his best, but he didn't know much more than I did." "How'd he die?" Matthew asked gently. "Fever. It came on fast, burned through him in less than a week. I tried everything I knew, but nothing helped. He just kept getting weaker, and then one morning he didn't wake up." She blinked back tears. "I buried him myself. Took me 2 days to dig the grave in frozen ground. I sang hymns because I didn't know what else to do, and then I was alone." "Why didn't you go back to Chicago?" "With what money?" "I sold the horse to buy supplies to make it through winter. Everything we had is tied up in this homestead, and even if I could get back, what would I return to? My father remarried after my mother passed. His new wife made it clear I wasn't welcome. That's part of why I was so eager to come west with Samuel." She stared into the fire. "I have nothing to go back to. This is all I have." Matthew was quiet for a long moment. "Then we'll make sure you keep it." The simple certainty in his voice made something flutter in her chest. "You said you were riding to Great Falls." "I am. But that job isn't going anywhere in the next week or two. I'll stay until you're set up proper, get you through the worst of the winter. By March, you'll be able to manage until spring comes full. You do that. Stay here for weeks." "If you'll have me, yes." He turned to look at her directly. "I'll sleep by the fire, work on your homestead, and when I'm sure you'll be safe, I'll move on. That's the deal." It was too generous, too kind, and Margaret didn't trust it. In her experience, men always wanted something. "And what do you get out of this arrangement? The knowledge that you won't end up like Clara." "That's enough." She wanted to believe him. Heaven help her, she desperately wanted to believe that someone could be this decent, this selfless. "What if the job in Great Falls is gone by the time you get there?" Matthew shrugged. "Then I'll find another job. There's always work for a man willing to do it, but there's not always someone to help a woman alone in the wilderness. Priorities, Mrs. Foster." "Margaret," she said softly. "If you're going to stay, you should call me Margaret." He smiled, that same small quirk of his lips that transformed his face. "Margaret, then, and it's Matthew, not Mr. Sullivan. Matthew." The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her pulse quicken. She stood abruptly. "I should prepare for bed. Tomorrow I can help with tomorrow you're resting those hands," he interrupted. "I'll handle the work. You can direct me, tell me what needs doing, but no heavy lifting or gripping tools. Understood?" She wanted to argue, but the bandages on her hands throbbed with every heartbeat, reminding her that she was in no condition to work. "Understood. Good." He stood as well, grabbing his bedroll from his pack. "I'll keep the fire going through the night, you just rest." Margaret retreated behind the curtain to her sleeping area, which consisted of a narrow bed with a straw mattress and her few spare blankets. She could hear Matthew moving around the main room, the soft sounds of him spreading his bedroll, banking the fire. Ordinary sounds, but they made the cabin feel less empty than it had in months. She changed into her nightdress and crawled under the blankets, her body aching in a dozen places. But beneath the pain was a strange lightness, the absence of the constant fear that had been her companion since Samuel's death. For tonight, at least, she wasn't alone. Someone else would keep watch, tend the fire, stand between her and the killing cold outside. Sleep came more easily than it had in months. She woke once in the night to the sound of wood being added to the fire. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see Matthew silhouetted against the flames, his profile sharp and alert. He wasn't sleeping, she realized. He was keeping vigil, making sure she stayed warm and safe. Something in her chest twisted, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly. But beneath that, something else. Something that felt dangerously like trust. When morning came, Margaret emerged from behind the curtain to find the cabin warm, coffee already brewing, and Matthew gone. Through the window, she could see him outside, already working on the woodpile. He must have been up before dawn. She dressed quickly and went outside, the cold biting at her exposed face. "You should have woken me to make breakfast," she called. Matthew looked up from his work. "You needed sleep more than I needed breakfast. There's coffee ready. I'll eat when I'm done with this section." The next week fell into a pattern. Matthew worked from dawn until dark, not just chopping wood but repairing the cabin's chinking, fixing a leak in the roof she hadn't been able to reach, reinforcing the lean-to, and a dozen other tasks she'd been unable to manage alone. Margaret cooked, cleaned, and tried to contribute where she could despite her healing hands. They fell into an easy rhythm, working in companionable silence, talking over meals. She learned he was 28, that he had a scar on his left shoulder from a steer's horn, that he could read and write thanks to a ranch boss's wife who taught him during a long winter similar to this one. He liked his coffee black, didn't care for sweets, and had once spent 3 months tracking a horse thief across Wyoming territory for a rancher who'd been good to him. He learned she was a widow at 23, that she could recite poetry from memory thanks to a Chicago schoolteacher who'd believed even stockyard workers' daughters deserved education, that she was terrified of deep water because she'd nearly drowned in Lake Michigan as a child. She liked sugar in her coffee, had a secret passion for dime novels about frontier adventures, and could sing in a clear soprano that made him stop working to listen. The promised storm came on the 3rd day, dumping 2 feet of snow across the landscape and trapping them inside the cabin together. They played cards with a worn deck Samuel had brought from Chicago, and Margaret won more often than not, much to Matthew's amused chagrin. "You're cheating somehow," he accused good-naturedly after she won the 5th hand in a row. "I'm simply better at this than you are," she replied, gathering the cards with a smile. "You may be better at chopping wood and fixing roofs, but I'm the queen of poker." "Queen of something," he muttered, but he was grinning. "Another hand." They played until the light faded, then made dinner together in the small space, moving around each other with increasing ease. Margaret was acutely aware of every time their hands brushed, every accidental touch. Matthew seemed likewise affected, pulling away quickly each time they made contact, as if burned. The attraction between them was becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, admiring the way his muscles moved under his shirt, the gentleness in his hands despite their strength. She noticed the way his eyes followed her across the room, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. It terrified her. Samuel had been dead less than 3 months. What kind of woman was she to be thinking of another man so soon? And yet, she couldn't seem to stop. Matthew had become the best part of her days. The cabin felt less like a prison and more like a home when he was in it. The future seemed less bleak when she imagined it with him nearby. On the 8th day, with her hands mostly healed and the weather clear, Margaret insisted on helping with the outside work. Matthew reluctantly agreed, and they worked together hauling water from the stream, now that she had the strength for it again. As they worked, Margaret slipped on a patch of ice. Matthew caught her before she fell, his arms coming around her waist, steadying her. For a moment they stood frozen, her back pressed against his chest, his breath warm on her neck. "Careful," he murmured, his voice rough. "Thank you." She didn't move, and neither did he. The moment stretched, charged with tension. Then Matthew released her abruptly, stepping back. "Watch your footing. Ice is treacherous." They didn't speak of it, but something had shifted. The air between them felt electric, heavy with possibility and restraint. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Margaret finally gathered her courage. "Matthew, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why haven't you married? You're a good man, a hard worker. You must have had opportunities." He was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. "I came close once. Girl in Cheyenne, daughter of a saloon owner. Her name was Beth. She was pretty smart, laughed at my jokes. I thought I loved her." He paused. "Then I found out she was just keeping me interested until someone better came along, someone with money and prospects. I was just a cowboy, barely scraping by. She wanted more. She was a fool, maybe, or maybe she was practical. I couldn't give her much." He looked at Margaret. "After that, I stuck to cattle drives and ranch work, easier than risking that again. Not all women are like Beth. I know." His gaze was intense, searching. "What about you? Did you love your husband?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been asking herself the same thing for weeks. "I cared for Samuel. He was kind to me, gave me a way out of Chicago, a chance at a different life. But love," she shook her head slowly. "I don't think I knew him long enough to truly love him. We courted for 3 months, married, and came west. And then he was gone. I mourn what we could have had, what we might have built together. But I'm not sure what we had was love or just 2 people desperate for something different. That's honest. I'm tired of lying to myself or anyone else. Life's too short and too hard out here for pretending." Matthew nodded. "Then I'll be honest too. These past 8 days have been some of the best I can remember. Not because the work's been easy, but because I've enjoyed being here with you." Margaret's heart hammered. "Matthew, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "You're a widow barely 3 months out from your husband's death. I understand the impropriety of what I'm feeling, but I wanted to be honest. You deserve that." She should have been scandalized. Should have sent him away, protected her reputation, mourned Samuel properly. But sitting there in the firelight, looking at this man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return, Margaret felt something break free inside her. "I enjoy being with you two," she admitted. "More than I should, more than is proper." "Then we're both improper," he smiled sadly. "But I'll still leave when the time comes if that's what you want. I won't overstay or presume." What if I don't want you to leave? The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Matthew's expression went very still. Margaret, you should be sure before you say things like that. I'm sure that I feel safer with you here than I have since Samuel died. I'm sure that I laugh more, worry less, and sleep better knowing you're on the other side of that curtain. I'm sure that when I think about you leaving, it feels like losing something precious. She met his eyes. I'm sure of all that. What I'm not sure of is whether I have any right to ask you to stay or whether you'd even want to. Matthew stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Want to? Margaret, I'd stay until the earth stopped turning if you asked me. But you need to understand what you'd be taking on. I'm just a cowboy. I don't have land or money. I'd be starting from nothing, building a life here on your homestead. You'd be the one taking all the risk. This is my homestead, she agreed. In my name because Samuel's death transferred the claim to me. Legally, any man I marry would control it. I'd never, I know. She stood as well, moving closer to him. That's why I'm willing to consider it. Because I trust you in a way I didn't even trust Samuel, if I'm being honest. Samuel was chasing a dream and I was just part of it. But you see me. You listen when I talk. You treat me like an equal, not property. You are an equal, Matthew said fiercely. You're strong and clever and you've survived things that would have broken lesser people. Any man who doesn't see that is a fool. Then be a fool who stays, she whispered. Please. He cupped her face in his calloused hands, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. If I stay, people will talk. The widow who took up with a drifter before her husband's grave settled. Let them talk. They're not the ones fighting to survive out here. If I stay, I'll want to marry you proper, do this right. Then we'll marry. The certainty in her voice surprised even her. Not right away. We'll wait until spring, let time pass. But yes, Matthew Sullivan, if you're asking, I'm saying yes. He searched her face. You're sure? You barely know me. I know you've been nothing but kind and honorable. I know you work hard and keep your promises. I know that when you look at me, I feel seen in a way I never have before. That's enough to build on. Matthew pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Margaret rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the firelight. I'll take care of you, he promised. I'll work this land, build us a real home, make sure you never have to worry about firewood or food or being alone again. And I'll stand beside you, she replied. Partners in this, equal shares in work and worry. He pulled back enough to look at her and then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he kissed her. It was gentle, tentative, nothing like the perfunctory kisses Samuel had given. This was a question and a promise all at once, and Margaret answered by kissing him back, her hands fisting in his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. I should go back to my bedroll. This is already pushing propriety. I know. But she didn't let go, and neither did he. They stood together for another long moment before Matthew finally, reluctantly, released her. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Matthew. She retreated behind the curtain, but sleep was long in coming. Her mind raced with possibilities and plans. She was really going to do this. Marry again. Take a second chance at building a life with someone. It felt reckless and right all at once. Over the following weeks, as January turned to February, Margaret and Matthew settled into their new understanding. They didn't hide their affection from each other, but they maintained proper boundaries, both aware of the scrutiny they'd face once word got out. Matthew continued improving the homestead. He built a proper chicken coop, planning ahead to when they could afford chickens in the spring. He expanded the garden plot, laying plans for what they'd plant when the ground thawed. He talked about bringing in a few head of cattle, maybe some pigs, building up the homestead into something that could support a family. Margaret found herself dreaming again, something she'd stopped doing after Samuel died. She imagined the cabin expanded, maybe a second room added on. She imagined children, their children, learning to work the land. She imagined growing old with Matthew, watching years pass in companionable partnership. They made a trip to Galesburg in mid-February, once the roads were passable. It was a small settlement, barely worthy of being called a town, with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a few scattered houses. The merchant, a shrewd-eyed man named Porter, looked between Margaret and Matthew with obvious speculation. "Heard Samuel Foster passed," he said as he tallied their purchases. "Shame that. You getting on all right out there, Mrs. Foster?" "I'm managing," Margaret replied evenly. "Mr. Sullivan has been kind enough to help with repairs and heavy work." "Sullivan, is it?" Porter's gaze assessed Matthew, who met it steadily. "You planning on staying in the area?" "I am," Matthew confirmed. "Mrs. Foster has offered me employment on her homestead." It wasn't quite a lie. They'd agreed to present it that way until spring, when they'd marry quietly and make the arrangement permanent. Porter clearly didn't believe it, but he had no grounds to challenge them. "Well, good luck to you both," he said, handing over their supplies. "It's hard country for anyone, let alone a woman alone." "I'm not alone," Margaret said quietly. "Not anymore." As they left the store, Matthew loading supplies into the small sledge they'd fashioned, a woman approached. She was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and a practical air. "Mrs. Foster." "I'm Ann Mercer. My husband and I have the ranch about 8 miles west of your place. I heard about your husband's passing. I'm so sorry we didn't get out to check on you sooner. Winter's been hard this year." "It has," Margaret agreed, surprised and touched by the approach. "Thank you for your concern." Anne's eyes flickered to Matthew. "And you are Matthew Sullivan, madam. I'm helping Mrs. Foster with her homestead." "I see." Anne's expression was shrewd but not unkind. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Foster, you're both welcome to come to our ranch for Sunday dinner whenever you're able. It's important to have neighbors you can count on out here." "Thank you," Margaret said sincerely. "That's very kind. Just being neighborly. We all need each other in this territory." Anne patted Margaret's hand. "You take care, dear, and don't be a stranger." As they drove the sledge back toward the homestead, Margaret felt lighter. "That was nice. I was worried everyone would judge." "Some will," Matthew said pragmatically. "Can't please everyone, but folks like Mrs. Mercer, they understand how things are out here. Survival trumps propriety most days." "I hope you're right." "I know I am. You've survived this long by being practical. Anyone with sense will respect that." February passed in a blur of work and planning. They grew more comfortable with each other, learning rhythms and habits. Matthew discovered that Margaret sang while cooking, old hymns and folk songs that filled the cabin with music. Margaret learned that Matthew carved wood in the evenings, whittling small figures with surprising delicacy, his large hands capable of remarkable precision. He made her a bird, a delicate songbird with spread wings, and she treasured it like gold. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Margaret confessed her terror of the wilderness, the way the isolation had nearly broken her after Samuel died. Matthew admitted his guilt over Clara, the nightmares he still had about finding her frozen body, even though he hadn't been there. They shared their scars, literal and figurative, and in the sharing, grew closer. The first crocus pushed through the snow in early March, a tiny purple bloom that seemed impossibly fragile and yet strong enough to defy the lingering cold. Margaret showed it to Matthew with delight, and he smiled at her joy. "Spring's coming," he observed. "Another month and the worst will be past." "Are you still planning to stay?" she asked, needing to hear it again. "Margaret, I'm not going anywhere unless you send me away." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I told you I'd stay, and I meant it. Forever if you'll have me." Forever sounds good. They decided to marry in April, once the weather fully turned and they could make the trip to Great Falls where a proper minister resided. Galesburg had a circuit preacher who came through occasionally, but they wanted something more official, more certain. While they waited, Matthew worked on expanding the cabin. He cut and hauled logs, preparing to add a second room before winter came again. Margaret helped where she could, and together they built something that felt less like survival and more like a future. In late March, a rider came to the homestead. Margaret tensed, but Matthew went out to meet him calmly. She watched from the window as the two men talked, saw Matthew nod, saw money change hands. When he came back inside, he was carrying a letter. Ryder was delivering mail from Galesburg. "Porter sent this out." He handed her the envelope. Margaret didn't recognize the handwriting. She opened it carefully and read, her eyes widening. "It's from a lawyer in Chicago. My father died last month." "I'm sorry," Matthew said quietly. "Don't be. He was never kind to me." She read further. "He left me a small inheritance. Not much, but something. Enough to buy livestock and seed for planting with some left over." Matthew's eyes widened. "Margaret, that's wonderful. It feels strange to be glad about his death." She set the letter down. "But this money, it means we can really build something here. We won't be starting from nothing." Matthew repeated and smiled. "I like the sound of that." April arrived with a rush of warmth and melt water. The landscape transformed from white to brown to the first hints of green. Birds returned, filling the air with song. The homestead felt alive again, full of possibility. They set out for Great Falls on a clear morning, both dressed in their best clothes. Margaret wore a simple blue dress she'd carefully preserved, and Matthew had a clean shirt and jacket that made him look almost citified. They took Matthew's horse, both riding together, Margaret seated in front of him with his arms around her to hold the reins. The ride took 2 days, and they camped one night under the stars, properly chaperoned by the vastness of the Montana sky. Matthew held her as they watched the fire burn down, and Margaret felt a peace she'd never known before. This was right. This was where she was meant to be with this man, building this life. Great Falls was a real town, with streets and buildings and more people than Margaret had seen in months. They found the church, met with the minister, and explained their situation. He was a kindly man with silver hair and sharp eyes that assessed them both carefully. "You're certain about this?" he asked Margaret directly. "You're a widow and you have rights to your homestead. Once you marry, those rights transfer to your husband." "I understand," Margaret replied. "And I trust Matthew completely." The minister turned to Matthew. "And you understand the responsibility you're taking on. A wife, a homestead, a life in hard country." "I do, sir, and I'll honor all of it." "Well then." The minister smiled. "Let's make this official." They married in the small church with 2 strangers pulled in from the street to serve as witnesses. Margaret spoke her vows clearly, meaning every word. Matthew's voice was steady and sure as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed her gently, and Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. Happy tears, the first she'd shed in months. They spent their wedding night in a small hotel in Great Falls, a luxury they could afford thanks to Margaret's inheritance. The room was simple but clean, with a real bed and privacy. And for the first time they came together as husband and wife. Matthew was gentle and patient, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Margaret had been nervous, her experience with Samuel limited and not particularly enjoyable, but Matthew made it different. He paid attention to her responses, adjusted to her needs, and when it was over, he held her close and told her she was beautiful. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness. "I should have said it before, but I was afraid." Afraid of what? That it was too soon, too fast, that I was betraying Samuel's memory. Matthew kissed her forehead. "You're not betraying anyone by choosing to live, and I love you too. Have since the day I watched you swinging that axe, too stubborn to quit even though you were bleeding." She laughed and cried at the same time, and he held her through both. They returned to the homestead as husband and wife, and set about building their life in earnest. With the inheritance money, they bought 4 chickens, 2 pigs, and 3 young cattle. Matthew built proper pens and enclosures. They planted a large garden with seeds from the general store: potatoes, carrots, beans, squash. Margaret worked beside Matthew, her hands growing calloused again, but this time from building rather than desperate survival. Summer came in full, and with it, hard work from dawn to dusk. But it was satisfying work, done together. They laughed as they worked, talked through problems, celebrated small victories. The first egg from their chickens was cause for joy. The day they finished the new room on the cabin, Matthew carried Margaret over the threshold like it was their wedding day all over again. Ann Mercer and her husband Tom became true friends, visiting occasionally and inviting Matthew and Margaret to their ranch for dinners and church services. Through them, Margaret and Matthew met other homesteaders and ranchers in the area, slowly building a community. There was talk, of course. Whispers about how quickly the widow Foster had remarried, speculation about whether Matthew had been around before Samuel died. But most people seemed willing to accept the simple truth. Life was hard in Montana territory, and sometimes you found happiness where you could. By August, Margaret suspected she was pregnant. She waited until she was sure before telling Matthew, anxious about his reaction. They'd never explicitly discussed children, though they'd talked about the future in vague terms. She told him one evening as they sat on the porch they'd built onto the front of the cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Matthew, I have something to tell you." He looked at her, concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I'm pregnant." He went very still, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming it into something radiant. "Truly, truly. Probably due in late winter or early spring." Matthew let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she shrieked with laughter. "We're having a baby," he said, setting her down and cupping her face in his hands. "Margaret, we're having a baby." "We are," she confirmed, joy bubbling up inside her. "Are you happy?" "Happy. I'm over the moon. I'm ecstatic. I'm terrified, but mostly I'm happy." He kissed her thoroughly. "We're going to be parents." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall. Matthew became almost comically protective, trying to prevent Margaret from doing any heavy work. She tolerated it for a while, then firmly told him that she was pregnant, not made of glass, and would continue working as long as she was able. They prepared for winter and for the baby, stocking supplies and making plans. Ann Mercer promised to come help when Margaret's time came, bringing her experience as a mother of 4. Matthew worked extra hard to ensure they had more than enough firewood, building the stack until it towered beside the cabin. "I'll chop, you rest forever," he told her seriously one day as she watched him work. "That's the promise I made myself when I first saw you out here, struggling alone. You'll never have to worry about staying warm again." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, something that happened embarrassingly often these days thanks to the pregnancy. "You've kept every promise you've made to me, and I'll keep making them and keeping them until the day I die," he replied, setting down the axe to pull her into his arms. "You and our child, you're my world now. Everything I do is for us." Winter came again, but this time it held no terror for Margaret. The cabin was warm and well stocked. They had food enough for months, and more importantly, they had each other. They spent the cold evenings planning names for the baby, arguing good-naturedly over choices. "If it's a boy, we should name him after your father," Margaret suggested. "My father was named Herbert. We're not doing that to our child." Matthew shook his head firmly. "What about your mother?" "What was her name?" "Rose. I like that for a girl. Rose Sullivan." Matthew tried it out. "I like it. And for a boy, James," Margaret said. "It's strong classic. James Sullivan." "James or Rose it is, then." The baby came in March, during a late winter storm that dumped a foot of snow overnight. Margaret's labor started just after dawn, and Matthew rode through the snow to fetch Ann Mercer despite the weather, his face pale with fear. Ann arrived within 3 hours, took one look at Margaret, and sent Matthew outside. "You'll just get in the way. Go chop wood or pace or whatever you need to do. I'll call you when it's over." The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the night. Matthew did chop wood, working frantically as if he could somehow help Margaret through the physical effort. He prayed, something he hadn't done since he was a child, begging whatever God might listen to keep his wife safe. Finally, as the storm broke and the stars came out, he heard the thin wail of a newborn. He dropped the axe and ran for the cabin, bursting through the door to find Ann cleaning a tiny, squalling infant while Margaret lay exhausted but smiling in their bed. "You have a son," Ann announced. "A healthy boy with good lungs." Matthew approached the bed slowly, awed. Margaret held out her arms and Ann placed the baby in them. He was impossibly small, red-faced and furious at being born, but perfect. "Absolutely perfect, James," Margaret said softly. "Our James." Matthew sat on the edge of the bed, touching one tiny fist with a finger, watching in wonder as the baby gripped it instinctively. "He's so small. He'll grow," Ann assured him with a laugh. "They always do." "Now, I'll stay tonight to make sure Margaret's recovering well, but after that, you're on your own, Papa." Papa. Matthew was a father. The thought was terrifying and wonderful all at once. He looked at Margaret, his wife, the mother of his child, and saw his entire world in that bed. "Thank you," he whispered. "For him, for giving me this family, for everything." "Thank you," she replied. "For saving my life, for staying, for loving me." They sat together, the three of them, a family forged in hardship and sealed with love. The years that followed were full of work and struggle, but also joy. James grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. 2 years after James came a daughter they named Rose, just as they'd planned. She was quieter than her brother, thoughtful and observant, with a talent for music that delighted Margaret. Matthew expanded the homestead steadily, building their herd, improving the land. He never took the inheritance money for granted, managing it carefully and making it stretch. By the time James was 5, they had a proper ranch, small but successful, with 24 head of cattle, a barn, an expanded house with 3 bedrooms, and a reputation as fair, hard-working folks. Margaret started teaching children in the area, holding classes in their home during winter months when travel was difficult. She loved teaching, loved sharing the education she'd received with children who had little access to schooling. Matthew supported her fully, often caring for Rose and James while Margaret worked with her students. They visited the grave Samuel had been buried in each spring, Margaret placing flowers and saying a quiet prayer. She'd made peace with that chapter of her life, grateful for what Samuel had given her, even as she acknowledged that what she had with Matthew was deeper, stronger, more true. The homestead became a gathering place for neighbors, a hub of community in the isolated region. Matthew and Margaret hosted barn dances in the summer, church services when the circuit preacher came through, and holiday celebrations that brought dozens of people together. Their table was always open, their door always welcoming. When James was 7 and Rose was 5, Margaret became pregnant again. This time, she barely slowed down, her body accustomed to the work of the homestead and the demands of pregnancy. She gave birth to twin boys in the fall, and Matthew held both of them, tears streaming down his face. "We're going to need a bigger house," he said, laughing through his tears. "We're going to need a lot of things," Margaret replied, exhausted but happy. "Starting with more diapers." They named the twins Peter and Paul, and the household became even more chaotic and joyful. James took his role as oldest brother seriously, helping corral his younger siblings. Rose became expert at changing diapers and singing lullabies. Matthew built yet another addition onto the house, and Margaret wondered if they'd eventually have a mansion by frontier standards. Life wasn't perfect. There were hard winters, lost cattle, sickness that terrified them both. When James broke his arm falling from a tree at 9, Matthew's face went white with fear. When Rose came down with a fever at 7 that lasted 3 days, Margaret barely slept, staying by her daughter's side until it broke. But through it all, they had each other. Matthew and Margaret had built something real, something lasting, from that first desperate moment when he'd taken the axe from her hands and promised she'd never have to fight alone again. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Matthew took Margaret back to the spot where he'd first seen her, struggling with the axe by the woodpile. The cabin had been expanded so much it was barely recognizable. The woodpile was always kept high, and the clearing was full of the sounds of children playing. "You ever regret it?" he asked, holding her hand. "Taking a chance on a drifter who showed up out of nowhere?" Margaret looked at their home, at their children, at the life they'd built together. "Not for a single second. You saved my life, Matthew Sullivan." "You saved mine too," he replied. "I was just existing before, drifting. You gave me purpose, a home, a family. Everything I have worth having, I have because of you." "We saved each other then." She leaned against him. "I like that better anyway, a partnership. Always has been, always will be." He kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Margaret Sullivan. I love you too." They stood together, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd claimed as home, listening to their children's laughter ring through the clear air. The wilderness that had once threatened to kill Margaret had become the foundation of her happiness. The cowboy who'd stopped to help had become the love of her life. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, growing up in Chicago. It was better. Harder, certainly, full of work and struggle and the endless challenges of frontier living. But it was real, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership, and a love that had grown from necessity into something irreplaceable. Years continued to pass in the rhythm of seasons. James grew tall and strong, learning ranching from Matthew with dedication that made his father proud. At 18, he began courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sensible girl named Catherine who could rope a steer and bake bread with equal skill. Margaret approved, seeing in Catherine the same practical strength she'd had to develop herself. Rose, at 16, was already being sought after by young men from 3 counties over. She had her mother's grace and her father's steady determination, and she'd announced her intention to become a teacher like Margaret. She helped with the school sessions, patient with the younger children, strict but fair with the older ones. The twins, Peter and Paul, 14 now and impossible to tell apart, were a whirlwind of energy and mischief. They kept the household lively, always getting into some scrape or another, but they were good boys, hardworking when focused, and devoted to their family. Matthew, at 42, had silver threading through his dark hair, lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. but he was still strong, still capable of a full day's work, still the solid foundation of their family. Margaret, at 37, had her own share of silver hair, and her hands bore the permanent marks of frontier labor. But she was content, genuinely happy in a way she'd never imagined possible. They'd faced challenges over the years. A prairie fire that threatened the ranch when James was 10, controlled only by frantic efforts from every able-bodied person within 20 miles. A particularly harsh winter when Margaret was pregnant with the twins that killed several cattle and tested their resources to the limit. The year Rose contracted scarlet fever, and they'd spent 3 weeks in terror before she finally recovered. But they'd also celebrated triumphs. The year their cattle herd reached 50 head felt like an impossible achievement. When James won a blue ribbon at the county fair for his calf, Matthew's pride was visible from across the field. Rose's first solo performance at the church social, singing with a voice that made grown men weep, was a moment Margaret treasured. The twins learning to raid, both at the same time as if one couldn't bear to be behind the other, had been comedy and joy combined. The community that had been sparse when Margaret first arrived had grown. Galesburg was now a proper town with a school, 2 churches, a doctor, and even a small newspaper. The railroad had come through, connecting them to the wider world in ways that seemed miraculous to those who remembered the isolation of the early days. Matthew and Margaret's ranch was respected, known for quality cattle and honest dealing. They'd helped new homesteaders get established, lending equipment and expertise freely, remembering their own desperate beginnings. They'd stood up against claim jumpers and land grabbers, fighting to protect not just their own property but their neighbors as well. On their 20th anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party. The house and barn filled with friends and neighbors, people whose lives Margaret and Matthew had touched over the years. There were speeches and toasts, stories shared about the couple who'd built something lasting in hard country. Ann Mercer, now silver-haired herself but still sharp as a tack, raised her glass. "When I first met Margaret and Matthew, I knew they were special. You could see it in how they looked at each other, how they worked together. They've built more than a ranch here. They've built a legacy of kindness, hard work, and community. We're all richer for knowing them." The toast was echoed by everyone present, and Margaret found tears streaming down her face as she looked around at the gathering. These were her people, her home. The lonely, terrified woman chopping wood to survive was a distant memory now, replaced by someone strong, capable, and surrounded by love. As the party wound down and guests departed, the family cleaned up together, working with the easy coordination of long practice. When the house was finally quiet, Margaret and Matthew sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. 20 years, Margaret mused. It seems impossible, and yet I can barely remember life before you. I remember every detail of the day I met you, Matthew said. You were so fierce, so determined not to show weakness, and all I could think was that you were the bravest person I'd ever seen, fighting so hard to survive. I was terrified. You were magnificent. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. You still are. We did all right, didn't we? Margaret asked softly. Built a good life, raised good children. We did better than all right. We built something extraordinary. Matthew looked at her in the fading light. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Every hard day, every struggle, every moment. All of it, just to end up here with you. Even the part where you had to chop mountains of wood because a stubborn woman wouldn't admit she needed help, he laughed. Especially that part. That's when I knew you were worth staying for. Anyone who fights that hard to live is someone worth building a life with. They sat in comfortable silence, The kind of silence only possible between two people who know each other completely. The sounds of the ranch surrounded them. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corral, the creak of the windmill Matthew had built 5 years ago. The sounds of home. Inside, they could hear their children getting ready for bed, the twins arguing over something, Rose telling them to hush, James settling the matter with his older brother authority. The sounds of family. "What do you think happens next?" Margaret asked. "The children will grow up, start their own families. What will we do when it's just us again?" Matthew considered. "We'll keep working the ranch as long as we're able. Watch our grandchildren grow, maybe take up new hobbies. I've been thinking about trying my hand at furniture making in the winters. And I'd like to write down some of our stories, the history of this place. Maybe publish them in the newspaper so people remember what it was like in the early days. We'll grow old together," Matthew said simply. "That's what happens next, and I can't wait." Margaret rested her head on his shoulder, content. 20 years ago, she'd been chopping wood to stay warm, fighting for her life in a desperate, lonely struggle. Then a cowboy had taken the axe and promised she'd never have to fight alone again. He'd kept that promise every single day since. The years continued their steady march. James married Catherine in a beautiful ceremony at the church, and Margaret cried happy tears throughout. A year later, they welcomed their first grandchild, a boy they named Matthew after his grandfather. Watching Matthew hold his namesake, seeing the wonder and love in his eyes, Margaret fell in love with her husband all over again. Rose pursued teaching, taking a position at the school in Galesburg and boarding with the Mercers during the week. She came home on weekends, bringing stories of her students and her life. And Margaret recognized her younger self in her daughter's fierce independence and loving heart. The twins, inseparable as always, decided to start their own ranch on land adjacent to the family spread. Matthew helped them get established, and Margaret found herself becoming the matriarch of a growing family empire. More grandchildren came. James and Catherine had 3 more children, daughters who reminded Margaret achingly of Rose at that age. Rose eventually married a banker from Great Falls, a quiet man who adored her, and gave Margaret 2 more grandchildren. The twins married sisters, causing endless confusion and amusement, and between them produced 5 more grandchildren in rapid succession. The house that had started as a single-room cabin was now the center of a sprawling family compound. Additions and outbuildings clustered around the original structure, which Margaret insisted they preserve. "That's where we started," she told her children. "Where your father saved my life and gave me a future. It stays." Matthew and Margaret settled into the role of grandparents with joy. They were the heart of the family, the steady center everyone orbited around. Holiday gatherings at the ranch included dozens of people, multiple generations sharing food and stories and love. In their late 50s, they finally took the trip they'd always discussed, but never managed. They traveled to Chicago so Matthew could see where Margaret had grown up. The city had grown almost beyond recognition, industrial and massive, and Margaret felt like a stranger in the place of her birth. "This was home once," she told Matthew as they stood near the stockyards. "But it doesn't feel like home anymore. Home is Montana, the ranch, our family." "Home is wherever we are together," Matthew replied. "Chicago or Montana, it doesn't matter as long as I'm with you." They returned to the ranch after 2 weeks, both relieved to be back in the wide open spaces they'd claimed as their own. Montana had shaped them, challenged them, but ultimately welcomed them. They were as much a part of the land now as the mountains and rivers. As they entered their 60s, Margaret and Matthew finally stepped back from the daily operation of the ranch, turning control over to James and the twins while maintaining advisory roles. It was bittersweet, letting go of work that had defined them for so long, but also freeing. Matthew did take up furniture making, crafting beautiful pieces from local wood. His tables and chairs became sought after throughout the territory, known for their quality and durability. He worked in a shop he'd built near the house, often surrounded by grandchildren watching in fascination as he shaped wood with patient skill. Margaret wrote her stories, and they were published in the local newspaper, then collected into a book that was distributed throughout Montana Territory. Frontier Tales. A Woman's Life in Montana became a regional bestseller, and Margaret found herself something of a local celebrity. She was invited to speak at schools and churches, sharing the history of the early days and the lessons she'd learned. Their 60th birthdays, just a year apart, were celebrated with enormous parties that lasted entire weekends. The ranch filled with family, friends, and well-wishers from across the state. The governor himself sent a letter of congratulation, acknowledging the Sullivans' contributions to Montana's development. At 70, Matthew's hands finally started to fail him, arthritis making the delicate work of furniture making difficult. He mourned the loss but adapted, spending his time teaching his grandsons the craft, passing on skills and knowledge. Margaret's eyesight weakened, making writing challenging, but she dictated stories to Rose, who typed them up for publication. They'd been married 45 years when James sat them down for a serious conversation. "Ma, Pa, Catherine, and I have been talking. We think you should move into town to Galesburg. The winters are getting harder and we worry about you out here." Margaret and Matthew exchanged looks. They'd known this conversation was coming, had discussed it privately. The homestead, their ranch, was becoming difficult for their aging bodies to manage, even with family help. "We'll consider it," Matthew said carefully. "But this is our home, James. Walking away won't be easy." "I know," James replied gently. "But there's a nice house available near the church. You'd still be close, could come out anytime. We just want you safe and comfortable." That night, Margaret and Matthew sat on their porch as they had so many times before. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think our son is right, much as I hate to admit it," Matthew sighed. "Last winter I fell on the ice, and if Paul hadn't been nearby, I could have frozen before anyone found me, and you can barely see to navigate after dark anymore. But this place is ours. We built it together. And it'll always be ours, no matter where we physically sleep. James and the twins will keep it going. Our grandchildren will grow up here just like our children did. The legacy continues." He took her hand. "But maybe it's time for us to have a quieter life. No more fighting winters, no more worrying about chores. Just us together, peaceful." Margaret resisted for a while, but ultimately, practicality won out. They moved to Galesburg the following spring, into a comfortable house with modern conveniences that seemed almost decadent. Indoor plumbing, a furnace for heat, electric lights powered by the town's generator. It was like living in the future. But they visited the ranch weekly, spending time with family, attending gatherings, maintaining connections. The homestead remained theirs in spirit, if not in daily presence. Their 50th wedding anniversary was celebrated with a party at the ranch that brought people from across Montana. 3 generations of Sullivans gathered, along with friends and neighbors old and new. The mayor of Galesburg gave a speech. The church held a special service in their honor. When it was Matthew's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his once powerful frame now bent with age but still commanding respect. 50 years ago, I was a drifter with no prospects, riding through Montana looking for work. I saw a woman chopping wood in the bitter cold, fighting to survive against impossible odds. I took that axe from her hands and promised she'd never have to fight alone again. That was the best decision I ever made." He looked at Margaret, his eyes still bright despite their age. "We've built a life together that exceeded my wildest dreams. We've raised 4 children, watched them grow into fine adults. We've been blessed with grandchildren too numerous to count without losing track. We've built a ranch, a legacy, a family. And through it all, Margaret has been my partner, my equal, my love. I am the man I am because of her." Margaret stood, tears streaming down her face, and Matthew took her hand. "I'll chop you rest forever," he whispered, quoting words he'd spoken 50 years ago. "That was my promise, and I've kept it gladly." "And I've loved you every day since," Margaret replied. "Through hard times and good, through struggle and triumph. You saved my life, Matthew Sullivan, and I've spent 50 years being grateful." They kissed, and the gathering erupted in applause and cheers. James raised his glass. "To Ma and Pa, who showed us all what love, partnership, and determination can build. To 50 more years. We'll be lucky to get 50 more days at our age," Matthew joked, and everyone laughed. But they did get more time. 5 more years of peaceful contentment in Galesburg, surrounded by visits from family, engaged in community life, content in each other's company. They were fixtures in town, the elderly couple who walked hand in hand to church every Sunday, who sat on their porch every evening watching the world go by, who exemplified what a marriage could be. Matthew passed away on a cold January morning, 77 years old, in his sleep. Margaret woke to find him gone, peaceful and painless in the end. She wept, but with gratitude mixed with grief. They'd had 55 years together, a lifetime of love and partnership. He'd kept every promise, been everything he'd said he'd be, and more. She buried him in the small cemetery outside Galesburg, near where Samuel had been buried over half a century before. The funeral was enormous, people traveling from across the state to pay respects. The governor attended. 3 dozen grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood graveside. The entire town of Galesburg shut down for the day. Margaret stood at the grave, supported by James and Rose, and spoke the words she'd prepared. "Matthew Sullivan was the best man I ever knew. He was kind, honorable, hardworking, and devoted. He saved my life, gave me a family, and loved me unconditionally for 55 years. I will miss him every day until we meet again. But I am grateful, so deeply grateful for the time we had. He showed me what love could be, and that gift will never fade." She lived 2 more years after Matthew passed, years spent with family, writing more stories, sharing memories. She never remarried. "I had the love of my life," she told Rose when asked. "You don't get that twice." On a spring morning with flowers blooming and birds singing, Margaret Foster Sullivan passed away peacefully at 74. She was buried beside Matthew, their graves marked with a single stone. Together in life, together in death. Partners forever. At her funeral, James spoke of his mother's courage, Rose of her wisdom, the twins of her humor and love. Grandchildren shared memories. Great-grandchildren who'd known her only in her elderly years spoke of her gentleness and the stories she told. But it was the youngest great-grandchild, a girl of 6 named Margaret after her great-grandmother, who perhaps said it best. "Great-grandma told me that sometimes life is hard and scary. But if you're brave, and you let people help you, and you choose love over fear, you can build something beautiful." She said she and great-grandpa built something beautiful together, and we're all part of it. The Sullivan Ranch continued through generations, growing and prospering. The original cabin was preserved, eventually turned into a museum of sorts, telling the story of Margaret and Matthew, of frontier survival and enduring love. Tourists came to see it, to hear the tale of the woman who'd been chopping wood to stay warm when a cowboy took the axe and promised she'd rest forever. Their story became legend in Montana, a tale of frontier romance and partnership that inspired countless others. Books were written, articles published, even a film made decades later that took considerable liberties, but captured the essential truth. Two people, meeting by chance in desperate circumstances, building something lasting through love, work, and unwavering commitment to each other. But for those who'd known them, for the family that carried on their legacy, Margaret and Matthew were simply Ma and Pa, Grandma and Grandpa, the foundation of everything good in their lives. They were love made manifest, proof that even in the hardest circumstances, with courage and compassion, people could create something beautiful. The homestead stood for over a century, eventually designated a historical landmark. Visitors walked the grounds where Margaret had once chopped wood in desperation, where Matthew had built a life with his bare hands, where 4 children had been raised and countless grandchildren had played. They stood by the woodpile, eternally maintained though no longer needed, and imagined that moment when everything changed. A woman chopping wood to stay warm, a cowboy taking the axe and saying, "I'll chop, you rest forever." A promise made and kept. A love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, enduring through generations. And in the way these stories do, it lived on, inspiring others to acts of kindness, to choosing love, to building something lasting in a world that often felt temporary and hard. Margaret and Matthew's legacy wasn't just the ranch or the family or the historical landmarks. It was the example they'd set. That one act of compassion could change everything. That partnership built on equality and respect could weather any storm. And that true love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures but about showing up day after day, keeping promises and building a life together one choice at a time. Their story was finished, their lives complete. But the impact of what they'd built together, of the love they'd shared and the family they'd created, rippled outward through time, touching lives they'd never know, inspiring people they'd never meet. In that way, they were eternal proof that what we build with love never truly dies, but lives on in the hearts and lives of those who come after. And somewhere in the Montana mountains, if you listened carefully on a cold winter night, you could almost hear the sound of an axe splitting wood, a promise being kept, and 2 voices intertwined in laughter and love, echoing through eternity.